Hi, I'm Brenda Reiss, freedom and forgiveness coach, and a person just like you that is learning to navigate life and all of its challenges. I teach a forgiveness process like no other. It's a blend of practical and spiritual forgiveness. This process guides you into knowing how unforgiveness can be keeping you stuck in your relationships, both personally and professionally, and how it prevents you from releasing resentment and finding joy. Each week, I share practical and some not so practical tips, tools, and advice from myself and other people that are on this journey just like us. This is for you if you are ready to turn your pain into peace. Welcome to the Forgive Yourself podcast. Hi, and welcome to the Forgive Yourself podcast. This is a place where you can turn your pain into peace. I'm your host, Brenda Reiss. And today we have a really special guest that I'm super excited to introduce you to. She is also a forgiveness coach, and so I'm really thrilled to share her with you. Louisa Hext is a skilled and experienced life coach, speaker, and storyteller. Her interest in the meaning of forgiveness originated from her almost 13 years experience as the North American coordinator of the photographic exhibition called The F Word, Stories of Forgiveness. It's an initiative of the UK-based The Forgiveness Project. Now, Louisa, as I said, is also a forgiveness coach. She, in her individual and group coaching, provides a safe space for inquiry to unpack and explore forgiveness with emotional awareness, empathy, compassion, and non-judgment. And you'll see how she is that when we start talking. Within her coaching practice, she partners with her clients to explore a deeper understanding of their unique story and the capacity for self-transformation. Louisa specializes in individual and group coaching around forgiveness, in particular, self-forgiveness and forgiveness in the family. She also is a beautiful storyteller, and she uses real stories to shine a light on others' journeys for healing and transformation. Oh my gosh, welcome, Louisa.
Well, thank you so much. It's so lovely to be here. I'm quite tickled to be with you too.
Yes, I love that you're a forgiveness coach, and I love all of your experience, and we'll get into that in a minute, around family, right? And around restoration. And of course, forgiveness would be just right in there. And so I would like, and my listeners would love to know, how did you become interested in forgiveness work?
Well, I think from a very early age, I was extremely curious about other people.
Mm.
And a story that we talked about earlier was when I was a little girl. I grew up in London, even though I live in the St. Paul, Minnesota area now. And I was visiting my grandma and grandpa on my dad's side. And there was a new man there, meaning I'd never seen him before. He was tall. He was wearing a suit. He looked really sad. And I was really young. And I looked up at him. And I knew there was a story there. And I wanted to know that story.
Oh.
And he was a survivor of Auschwitz concentration camp. You see, my entire family on my paternal side were survivors and not, all the way to my great-grandparents, my aunts and uncles.
Wow.
Some of them had migrated following the war, and some had immigrated prior, so during Nazi Germany. And I was always a realizer that I may not have been here had my grandparents not survived, because then my dad wouldn't have been here.
Right.
And I always wondered if people who had survived big wars or been survivors of absolute pain and terror could ever forgive the person that had harmed them from a very early age.
Wow, you were going deep at a young age, girl.
Kind of crazy, kind of crazy. My mom would tell me that I always was worried about things that a little girl shouldn't be worried about.
Mm.
that I was always concerned about the kid with a disability or about racism or about just people who weren't getting along. And it's interesting because I ended up in a career doing all of those things. So,
Yeah. No, I believe, I think we come in with certain tendencies, right? You came into this world with compassion, deep, deep compassion. And no wonder you do the work you do, because I'd like you to share what is your undergraduate and graduate work, because that I think also leads into this compassion and forgiveness work that you do.
yeah. So, in a nutshell, my undergraduate work, I studied at the University of Liverpool, was my idea was that Holocaust education had to be a standalone subject, and you couldn't possibly consider other approaches to genocide or multicultural anything, which is not who I am today. I took a 180-degree
Yeah.
turn when
Yeah.
I realized, hearing stories of others, that this was a place and an opportunity for us to learn about one another and to better understand why atrocity happens and look for different ways to move forward in life and to begin educating peace at a very early age, rather than teach it what war happened or what atrocity happened, but how do we teach peace in the classroom? And so my focus of my undergraduate actually evolved. And just a couple of years later, when I got a scholarship to the Ohio State University to study sociology, I laugh because you can't call it Ohio State, the Ohio State. And I wanted to gather stories of individuals who, in their first person, could shine a light on their experience of survival. And I interviewed Jewish women, Holocaust survivors, who happened to live at that time in London, England, which is where I was from,
Okay.
and Columbus, Ohio, which is where I went to grad school. And it was a very small project, probably interviewed maybe 10 women. It was in the late 80s.
Okay.
And I later gifted those oral stories. They weren't video, but oral stories to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And they have been digitized. So you could actually hear how I sounded when I was a mere 21 years old with a very strong English accent, less so today. I don't even recognize myself when I listen to those.
Oh, I bet. How powerful. And to have those stories alive,
Yeah.
right? Still alive in a museum where people can hear them.
Was an absolute gift to and a privilege for them to want to take those stories and put them in their archive. So,
Absolutely. I mean, how did that feel for you hearing those stories?
well, I kept, because I'm a very curious person,
Mhm.
I wondered all the time, and what if it were me? What if I were the individual who was standing in the shoes of the other? This whole language of empathy. I wanted to better understand
Yeah.
what that experience was like. Because as a person, we tend to be a pretty judging group of people on this
Yeah,
earth, right?
we do. We do.
We
Yes.
tend
We
to
are.
we have judgment. And I was always curious about how people were able to get on with their lives. So when you asked me what was it like, I had a series of questions where I wanted to know how people, in particular women, were able to survive. And I had it kind of wrong. I thought it was, once again, that it was a Jewish woman's story. It was their experience of survival like no other. But in fact, it was the experience of a woman, the female gender, that their lived experience and their ability to survive was quite different than that of men. I didn't go on to do intensive research in that area, but it was very clear to me that there were certain themes that came up amidst the stories that were shared with me and the narrative that came out.
Oh. Do you
So,
remember some of those themes? What were the themes?
yeah, so the themes very clearly were about being in relationship with one another. So there were mother-daughter relationships that evolved that weren't necessarily biological mother-daughter relationships, but an elder with somebody who was younger supporting one another. There were sisterhoods,
Oh,
groups of women, some of whom knew each other previously and others who didn't. There were stories of sharing food,
oh,
not just keeping it for themselves.
yeah.
There were stories of creating purpose in the future when they survived and who their Prince Charming was going to be, how many children they were going to have, being able to go back to the home that was their home where they learned their values. You know, a lot of these stories actually are our stories today. You know, when we think about the storytelling, I didn't really ask the question, and do you forgive? That
Yeah.
that was not something certainly that you ask a person who's experienced such pain, oppression, annihilation. And yet, as you know, there are people who have experienced the Holocaust, who've experienced genocide in South Africa, for example, and in Rwanda that have chosen to forgive.
Yes. And you have a story about that
I
that
do.
I would love for you to share because I know people have heard her name before, but maybe not. You had a special relationship with her. So, would you tell us who that is and tell us the story? Because I think this is so powerful.
Eva Kor. Eva Kor has to be one of the most amazing women that I have ever met. She was brilliant. She was funny. She was tough. She had her own opinion. We didn't always agree. And her claim to fame, I mean, literally, is that she forgave the Nazis. She made a decision. Now, this is really important. She made the decision perhaps 30 years after being liberated at 10 years old from Auschwitz. She and her sister, Miriam, survived the Mengele experiments.
Ugh,
You know the story of Joseph Mengele, and
yes.
he experimented on twins. And the gift, so to speak, was that Eva and her sister were imprisoned quite late in the Nazi regime.
Okay.
So there was a shorter period of time that they had to survive. However, if they each didn't survive, then neither would have survived.
Mm.
And this was what happened to twins, is because Mengele experimented 6 days a week, apart from on Sunday. And on Sunday, he would go to church with his family.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. I mean, it's just an interesting story to even imagine. And had I lived your life, would I have done what you did?
Hmm.
Likely not. But to even ask that question. So Eva, she survived beyond Miriam's years. Miriam had a lot of medical challenges following her liberation and died a number of years before Eva did. And Eva did not choose to forgive until many years later. And I asked her, just as so many other people have asked her, and why did you choose to do that? And she said, I did it for myself. it was my form of chemotherapy. She
Mm.
said I had to release that pain and suffering. And not only did she do it in practice, she did it in how she presented herself. And one of the perfect examples of how she dressed, and not to discredit you look beautiful in black, but you look great. Eva used to dress in black,
Yeah.
and she didn't dress in black to be a person who's living with class and sass and beauty. She did it
Mm.
to be dark, and
Yeah.
she did it to hold on to her pain and suffering. And then one day, I'm probably reducing this a little bit, but she
Yeah.
stopped dressing in black. And if you would Google her, or however you look for stuff on
Mhm.
Facebook or on the internet or on Instagram or anywhere, you'll see this beautiful woman in really deep blue.
Mm.
She always wore blue. And she told her story all of the time, often on a daily basis. Her passion were kids because
Mm.
she wanted the kids to be her future and our future. They were the future.
Yes.
She didn't particularly love adults. And she didn't particularly like to speak to Jewish audiences
Oh.
because the Jewish community would say, "How dare you?
Oh, yeah. I can
You have
understand that.
no right to forgive." She didn't speak for the Jewish community. She didn't speak for me. She didn't speak for anyone other than herself. And once again, she did that for her own healing process. So that is the experience I had with her. She mentored me. Uh, I worked with her a little bit in terms of inviting her to speak at events previously through my work with the Forgiveness Project.
Mhm.
And I visited her in Terre Haute, Indiana, which is where she lived. She lived in Terre Haute, Indiana, because her husband was liberated by an American GI from Terre Haute, Indiana, who invited them to come and live in the US. And so they came actually from Israel, which is where they went after leaving Poland,
Okay.
lived a number of years in Israel, came to the US, and she opened a museum, which is called Candles. And it is specifically related to the twins who were part of her life and at Auschwitz. And her son, Alex Kor, is now very much involved with Candles. So it still exists.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did she ever say, was there any forethought about forgiveness? Was it just one day she just said, I'm going to dress differently?
You know, Alex would probably be able to answer that
Yeah.
question. And if any of your listeners or viewers want to know, I can definitely find out the
Yeah.
answer. What I do know is that there was something that she did that led her on the path, along that path.
Okay.
And it was kind of a strange thing that happened. Someone somewhere in the US asked her to sit on a panel with the Nazi doctor that had signed the one death certificate for each gas chamber of individuals who had lost their lives, which was
Oh,
the most really ridiculous thing to ask either of them.
yeah. Yes.
What she did, instead of sitting on that panel, and I'm forgetting the name of this gentleman, he
Mhm.
did not have to go through the War Crimes Tribunal.
Okay.
And I think it's because he was pretty low on the totem pole. And she sought him out and she invited him to come back to Auschwitz and to speak his story at Auschwitz, Birkenau. and
Wow.
he accepted the invitation. So he came. And I think this was part of her journey.
Mm-hmm.
And she also is well known for getting his signature on the document that said there were indeed gas chambers at Auschwitz.
Oh, I remember something about that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's pretty. So I don't know if
Right.
there was, what I do want to share though, is that to forgive is not necessarily a radical act. A radical act would be if your intention after a significant harm would be the intention to quite immediately forgive.
Yeah.
That was not
Yeah.
her path.
Mm-hmm.
It was many, many years. I think the root of her decision to forgive was recognizing that the pain and suffering was too great and that there was another choice. That holding on to that pain and suffering as if it was that place of protection was not serving her anymore. It had served her. And in the work that we do, Brenda, as you know, we do things for a certain amount of time, perhaps for years and years, to protect ourselves. And then something happens and we're ready to do something different.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that that was the path that she took.
Oh, thank you for sharing that.
Uh,
That's so
it's too
powerful.
much.
Well, but it's right. It's and for our listeners too, it's we share these stories in the understanding like you and I talked about before. Remember, it's not an immediate thing. It's not a miracle in a way, right? It's just not it's not instantaneous. It was years. And
Mhm.
because a lot of people are sitting here with pain of like we talked about, like I hate my ex or I can't stand my mother or this person is mean to me. My boss is never gives me a raise. And they feel bad for having these feelings, but that's okay. Resentment is valid, in the sense of that it doesn't have to be huge like that. But what this story gives me is hope that, that it can be done, that forgiveness is a choice and
Yeah.
it's a process.
Yeah. And the other thing that I think is really important to share with your listeners and viewers is that the sense of harm that we feel as individuals does not have to be compared to the story of someone such as Eva Kor.
Yeah.
Maybe it's an opportunity to go, and if Eva can do that, perhaps I can.
Mhm.
Perhaps for me, in my life, in Louisa's life, she was my shiro,
Yeah.
that I can take a path because we all, perhaps I'm an expert, but in my own life, I'm not, right?
Mhm.
Probably need you, Brenda. My own journey in which in one moment I choose to forgive and in the next moment I unforgive. And something that you touched on that I think is really important is that it is a process, it being the road to releasing our pain and suffering, which could be described as forgiveness.
Mhm.
That for many of us, we don't even know that that's what's happening, but we don't like being resentful or holding onto a grudge or letting the judgment that we have for a colleague at work seep into our personal lives so that our partner says to us, you're bringing your work home and it's destroying our relationship. That there are ways to do this work, to know yourself better.
Yes.
And Eva started to know herself better. And she made that decision to take action because forgiveness is not a thing. It's an act. It's an action. To me, it's a verb.
It's a verb. Yeah, exactly.
So yeah.
Yeah, I think forgiveness is love in action. Really.
Yeah.
Because I think of love as a verb also. But I think it's a huge part of loving ourselves.
And the other piece that I think is really important to share, and I know that you've shared this before because I'm an avid listener of your podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have to plug you too.
Thanks.
That forgiveness, or to forgive, or to release your pain and suffering, whatever it is, or to make a choice and not know how, has to be one of the most courageous things that one can do. And yet for so many, it's considered weakness.
Yes.
And it's not. It's not. And you know what? It is uncomfortable.
Mhm.
It is messy. It is a place where we feel like we're drowning when we're in the midst of it. And yet going around it rather than through it makes it so much more difficult. And it takes longer that way.
It yes, we both know that, don't
Yeah.
we?
Yeah.
I'd love to touch on, you have some wonderful coaching questions, and you have a favorite coaching question, and that we were talking a little bit about the questions that you ask. And I'd love if you would share that with the listeners and viewers, because I think that they're quite, and they can take these and inquire about themselves. Of course,
Yeah.
I highly recommend working with a forgiveness coach as yourself and myself. Yet I love these questions.
So, we know as coaches, one of the most important things is to be curious.
Mm. Yes.
If we weren't curious, actually, we wouldn't be coaches. And if we want an individual who was interested in working with a coach, then you wouldn't be curious. The challenge is, how do we speak our curiosity?
Mm.
Because so often we have conversations in our head. And so one of my favorite has to do with what we secretly desire. For example, what is it that you secretly desire when it comes to forgiving yourself or someone else?
Mm.
And who do you secretly desire to forgive? Which is essentially the same question, but just offered in a different way.
Yeah, no, I like that, because you could look at it differently, because who and what,
Yeah,
right? I could be looking for peace. I could be looking for just, I want to feel better. What is it you secretly desire is a beautiful question, along with who,
yeah,
because I think this is, and you may find this too, a lot of people don't really realize how many resentments or grudges they're holding against different people, right?
absolutely true. Absolutely
Yeah.
true. And the other thing, it's so interesting in uh, the group coaching that I facilitate.
Yeah.
I say facilitate because every single time the small group drives the process, because it takes on the flavor, the character, the personality of those in the group. So I can have the same skeletal 4-week, 90-minute sessions,
Yeah.
and not one is the same.
Yeah.
And what ends up happening is you'll have somebody that comes. I'm thinking of an individual right now who's in a group that I'm working with, who is writing a memoir about her family, and she wanted to better understand what forgiveness was because she's writing about her father, and she's very deep, and she's an excellent writer. And one of the questions I ask in the group is, can you come up with one word, just one word, that defines forgiveness for you? And she thought that that was quite elementary. Whereas for others,
Yeah.
one word is so powerful, like what you just shared, Brenda: peace,
Yes.
serenity,
Mhm.
trust. The list goes on. Another experience I had was presenting to a group, a very large group, over 150 people who work in the field of social service in
Uh,
Minnesota. And there was a little, you know how you have those apps where you can engage with your audience prior to
Yeah.
get people to come, right?
Yeah.
Ask that question in the app, and I must have had 50 different responses to what is one word that defines forgiveness for you. And I think it's powerful because it gets us started, it gets us thinking, it gets us curious. And then we can take steps along the path with an uncertain destination, I think, right? No
Absolutely.
direct,
Nope.
where we can unpack what it is for every single person.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh. This is like, if we're coming up on our time, we're going to have you back because we have more to talk about. But I'd like to end with how can people get a hold of you?
Yes. So I'm going to tell you, I can be found currently by going to my website, which will be new and bright in the future. But I do have an active website, and it is consultantshext.com.
Great. And we'll put that in the show notes
And
too.
so the story about the website name, and I'm looking at my dad right now in this beautiful picture, is that his dream was to have a business in the United States. And he had a business called Consultants Hext. So when he died in 2012, I'm like, I didn't have a website then, and I needed a website. So I made that website. So my last name, my surname is Hext. So
Okay.
consultantshext.com is how you can find me. And Louisa at consultantshext.com.
Yes.
That's an easy way to find me.
Great. And you have like a little giveaway, a little gift for our listeners and viewers.
So I have two little giveaways.
Great.
One is a replay of an hour-long webinar that I recorded. I don't typically record my webinars. And on this occasion, I did. And it came out pretty well.
Right.
And I can provide that link to you, perhaps. You might even have it, actually. But I'm happy to provide it to you.
Okay.
And then I'm giving people I'm going to offer a 60-minute discovery session, which is essentially a chat with Louisa. It's not
Yes.
a deep, intensive anything, but it's an opportunity to answer that question.
Well, and it's a beautiful gift of time.
Yeah.
60 minutes is quite a bit of time to be able to feel comfortable and safe in expressing with someone like you who understands, who has a vast background, who understands and can help someone through what would be the best next steps, right? That's what I like to do with people. It's like,
Yeah.
it's what is the best next steps for you? Because maybe it's not time to forgive. Maybe it's time to work on some other things first.
That's really important.
Yeah.
People do not have to forgive. And I'm not a coach that teaches steps to forgiveness. It's a space for inquiry to unpack the messy, complex subject. And the 60-minute discovery session is unique for your listeners and viewers because I typically am offering a 30-minute.
Oh, thank you.
Because it has to be different. It has to be special, right?
Yes. Well, from forgiveness coach to forgiveness coach, I appreciate that because having a little bit more time with someone who specializes in this work is so valuable. I mean, that's what got me into forgiveness coaching was somebody taking that time to help me. And
Yeah.
so I love to give that back. Oh my gosh, Louisa, you are such a blessing.
So are
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.
You are. I feel so grateful. It's such a privilege to share time with you and space with you. And I hope I can come hang with you again.
You are going to. Now, do you have any parting words or you like quotes, right? Do you have a quote to share or anything?
Yeah, I do. It's lengthy, but it will make sense.
Yes.
So are you familiar with Alexander Solzhenitsyn?
No.
He was a Russian dissident, and he was a novelist and a poet.
Okay.
And I'm going to explain what it is before I share. But I think so. Imagine all of us when we have these resentments, saying, you know what? I wish there was an island that we could just go put all those horrible people on the island. We could leave everybody else on our island,
Yeah.
and we'd live life kumbaya, right? But it doesn't really work that way, right? And why? When I'm going to read this,
Okay.
if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of their own heart? So the message, simply put, because we're fallible, we're human. And this idea, they say there's a light side and a dark side. There are pieces of us that are not necessarily perfect, and we were never expected to be perfect. The other piece of it is that I try really hard not to define a person by an act. And I think we get stuck in the act and rather who that person is. And someone will say, but there are things that are unforgivable, and I agree with that. We can go on and on and on, but what the quote offers is this opportunity to look for common ground, perhaps. There's a Rumi quote that he talks about, let me meet you in the field.
Yes.
I don't know the exact language, but I'll meet you there. Perhaps we can, find that commonality in which we may not agree, but possibly we can recognize that there's a way forward together.
Oh, thank you.
Nice.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. All right. I hate to stop the conversation, but we will have another one, and we will do that soon. So, Louisa, thank you again with my heart, all my heart. Thank you
so much for having me. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much for listening today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did enjoy it, would you do me a favor and share this episode, and then follow us on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss one episode of the Forgive Yourself podcast, where every Friday you will get tips, tools, and stories so that you can turn your pain into peace. Take care.